Okay. Then we'll have to end the stream. Okay. Thank you.
So, good morning to all. Thank you for coming. It's lovely to have Luigi Caranti here at this faculty. I think Luigi doesn't need very much introduction, but I would like to say that he is full professor of political philosophy at the University of Catania, and also the main coordinator of our European project, JUSTLA. Luigi is widely internationally recognized by his account of Kant's political legacy and has particularly engaged with criticism of contemporary theories of democracy. And the paper he is going to present today has to do with this last line of research. The title is 7 Democratic Pathologies, a Kantian Analysis. It's lovely to have you here, Luigi, and to hear your thoughts about this very important issue. And I'm also sure that your conference will spark a lively discussion later in the Q&A. Thank you for coming, and you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Nuria, and thank you all for being here on such a short notice and this difficult, time in terms of temperature and schedule for everyone. Very close to the holidays, I'm thrilled to be here and to be discussing my latest paper. This is going to be published in a book edited by Raidar Malix and Michael Kriuluk for Cambridge University Press. And it's still in the making, because I am exactly at the moment in which I received the first set of comments by another contributor, Paul Geyer, on this paper, and then also another set of comments by the two editors, Kriuluk and Raidar. So anything more that you can add to this set of comments and criticism would be extremely helpful to get to the final shape of the chapter. Okay, and of course, many thanks to all of those of you who are part of this Justice in the 21st Century project, which I think is relatively significantly relevant for the topic that I'm discussing, because of course, as you know, one of the work package has to do with democratic backsliding. What are the causes of this? There are many theories, as you know, about why democratic backsliding did happen. One is, related to economic issues, among which the booming of economic inequality, and I am myself very attracted to that explanation. But in this paper, I'm not discussing this issue. I think that this is going to be the topic for end of September, if we will resume again. So the way in which economic inequality and the size that it has taken in the last 20 years has to do with democratic backsliding across the globe. But today we do something different. We investigate within the logic of democracy, so quite independently of how it has been practiced in the liberal democratic world in the last 20, 25 years. So it's a more theoretical approach, a more abstract approach that tries at least to identify tendencies, pathological tendencies that are typical of this form of government. And of course, I take my lead from a peculiar interpretation of Kant's criticism of democracy as it is presented in particular in To Perpetual Peace. So I identify 7 main democratic pathologies, which I list here. But the most important of which, the one that I use in a certain way, the one that I attribute to Kant as his own worry about democracy, has to do with partisanship. This has generated a little bit of hermeneutical debate with Michael Gregory, who has published recently an element for Cambridge University Press, on which he takes up this issue, criticizes my interpretation, and quite independently of the debate between Michael and I, another stream of Kant interpretation has emerged, I would say, in the last 10 years, that insists a lot on the so-called actual consent reading of Kant. And the main idea, as we will see, is that Kant grows in favor of democracy from the 80s to the 90s, especially in the doctrine of right. He becomes way more friendly to democracy than he used to be before. And I'm going to say something about this actual consent reading, which gives me the opportunity to rethink what Kant means by legislative power and by laws in general, which I think is an important point, often missed by interpreters, and yet absolutely crucial to make sense of Kant's political theory in general. So, in addition to partisanship, I extend the analysis to 6 extra pathologies: tyranny of the private, not to be conflated with the Tocquevillian tyranny of the majority, famous analysis from the 19th century of the problem with democracy. Then a conflation between the electorate and the people, a peculiar threat to the separation of powers, the illusion of the unlimited mandate, democratic nationalism, and procedural obsession. So I don't want to take much time. I will go fast on my own interpretation and the hermeneutical debate that it has generated. If you are interested, of course, I'm happy to go back in the Q&A session. But basically, my reading of Kant's famous remark in Perpetual Peace that democracy properly called is necessarily despotic. Now, the way in which this claim has been received by interpreters, as I would say has been diffused by interpreters, is by assuming that what he means is only direct democracy. So he's criticizing the Athenian form of democracy, in which apparently everybody would go there in the assembly, and then there was often the phenomenon of ostracism. That is, okay, we don't like that guy because he's our political opponent. We vote him out of the city and we force him to go, I don't know, to Syracuse or to somewhere else where he is no longer a political problem for us. So Kant interpreters usually think that all Kant is saying is that there is something dangerous about direct democracy, because there you may find cases of the mass, the people using political power against somebody. Well, I think that this interpretation is good as it goes, because it is true that what Kant has in mind when he talks about democracy into perpetual peace, and you understand that if you look at the preparatory notes of perpetual peace, is precisely direct democracy, and the ancient form, Athenians, Periclean forms of democracy. That does not mean, and this is the part that I think everybody misses, that does not mean that the problem that he identifies in direct democracy of the past does not apply to representative democracy as well, so the one that we are accustomed to. This is the most important part of what Kant is telling us, or what we can infer from his analysis of the problems with direct democracy. For example, Bert and Hruska think that all he's saying is that in direct democracy there is a necessary conflation between the executive and the legislative power, and this by itself constitutes despotism, because of course, I remind you, the official definition of despotism for Kant is the absence of separation of power. And yet, I think that this interpretation does not hold for many reasons that I'm not going to discuss here because it would take too much time. But I think that if you want to understand what Kant has in mind, you have to read a couple of lines later than when he says democracy is necessarily despotic, because he then talks about Frederick II. And Frederick II is presented as a servant of the state. He's the ruler that rules precisely the way in which it should be done, right? So he's the servant of the state. He always puts, or is believed to put, always the general good first, with no pushing of any partisan agenda, his own agenda, the agenda of his group, the agenda of a group he doesn't belong to, it doesn't matter, but without partisanship. So that's the hero, that's the political hero for Kant, Frederick II. And Kant says explicitly, the attitude of Frederick II in democracy is impossible. Impossible is a strong word, but what he means, I think, is that in a democracy, you are allowed, if not encouraged, to use your share of political power to advance your agenda. Your meaning your private agenda, the agenda of your party, the agenda of your group, the agenda of your class, the agenda of whatever section of the population, but still a partisan agenda. It's in the logic of the system, right? Okay, I push for this partisan agenda, but you can do the same. You can push for your own partisan agenda. And, so I don't have to worry that I'm pushing for something that serves only the interest of a part of the population, because you are doing the same. And therefore, apparently, the assumption is that these two partisan attitudes cancel each other out. And therefore, the composition of this partisan interest in the political game will result into a decision that for some reason is assumed to be fair, right? Well, Kant says, no, that's exactly the opposite of what Frederick II does. That's not the way in which political power should be used. And if we degrade political agency to the advancement of a political agenda that is balanced by the advancement of a different political agenda, and then there is a composition of these different interests, the best we can get is a modus vivendi, to use Rawlsian terminology, but there is no guarantee whatsoever that the result of these conflicting agendas will be something that Kant says is against somebody. And this is another hallmark of democracy for Kant in this passage from Perpetual Peace. So my interpretation is that Kant's problem with democracy has to do with the intrinsic partisanship of political agency that is, so to speak, allowed, if not encouraged, by the logic of the system. Now, recently, as I said, Mike Gregory has this beautiful element called Kant and Democracy, in which he thinks that what Kant is attacking is not democracy per se, but it's populism. So they are understood here as the identification of majority with the general will. And of course, the textual basis for that is Kant's sentence, all that, however, are not all decide X and Y. But he has nothing against constitutional democracy as we know it, Gregory argues. Now, he has a point, I think, in criticizing my reading when he says, well, look, what you are saying is that the problem has to do with an attitude of political actors, right? I have this attitude of being in favor of the partisan agenda, of pushing the partisan agenda. The others have the same attitude, and this generates a problem. Now, Gregory says, well, if the problem is an attitude, then it becomes difficult to explain why Kant says that democracy is necessarily despotic. Because if, in order to be necessarily despotic, it can be an attitude, because an attitude can change, right? So what if, as I myself argue, what if the democratic citizens are so mature, politically mature, that they do not use their share of political power to advance a partisan agenda? They might do it in the right way, as Frederick II used to do. And at that point, where is the necessity of despotism in the democratic system, right? Well, I don't know. Maybe Gregory is right, and maybe Bert and Hrushka are right in arguing that you can only make sense of the necessity of despotism by relying on the fact that apparently direct democracies necessarily collapse executive and legislative power. The idea being that since everybody participates in the assembly, when they sit in the assembly and make a decision, they are at the same time exercising the legislative function and executive function. There is no distinction between the two. And if you wish, at times also a judiciary function, as when they send to ostracism somebody. And of course, this clashing of the powers into the same body, in the hands of the same people, of course, generates necessarily despotism. Well, maybe so. I myself sometimes have my own doubts, but first of all, it would be hard to explain why Kant says that the problem is the attitude opposed to the one that he sees in Frederick II. Number two, I think that since he's talking about direct democracy, he might have in mind something like, when you do not have a representative, but you speak for yourself in the assembly, so democracy in the proper sense of the word is the sentence, right, that Kant uses. If you are in that condition, it is almost impossible not to speak for yourself. It looks like that you are called to enter and participate in the assembly precisely to bring your own voice, to bring your own interests, to bring your own agenda. So you don't represent anybody but yourself in a democracy, right? So that is true. And of course, as you recall, I said, that's what Kant has in mind. But if the problem is that you have this attitude of representing yourself and not the general good, this may necessarily happen in a direct democracy, but very likely happens also in a representative democracy. Because after all, when you vote for somebody as opposed to someone else, if you do it because the guy promises to advance your own agenda and the other doesn't, you are replicating exactly the same logic. The fact that you are now sending a representative to a parliament in order to advance a partisan agenda doesn't decrease the partisanship of the game at all. So I think that my reply to Gregory is to say, look, what might be a necessary despotism in direct democracy is a very likely despotism in representative democracy, in the sense that you are still under this logic, you are still necessarily exposed to the tendency of using your share of political power for advancing a partisan agenda, this time through the election of certain representatives, certain parties, or whatever. So I don't think that I have zero resources in order to make sense of the necessity that Kant talks about in comparable peace. Now, the other problem I have with Gregory's interpretation is that reducing the significance of Kant's criticism to an attack against populism doesn't seem to do justice to the depth, to the significance, to the importance of Kant's analysis. Because I think he's not talking about a degeneration of democracy, he's talking about the very logic of democracy, which applies even without degeneration. So I think that Kant's concern cuts much deeper than the usual problem with the populists that conflate majority and the people, tyranny of the majority and the like. Because even if there is no dominating majority, even if there is no part of the population that exercise, tyrannical power over the rest of the population, as in the famous Tocquevillian analysis of the dangers to which democracy is exposed. Still, even if there is no dominant group, if politics is reduced to the clash between roughly equal yet opposed political agendas, you are still in the condition of despotism. You are in a modus vivendi in which the result, the decision, the political decision will be just the result of these opposing forces that have no concern whatsoever to respect the rights and prerogatives of all, that do not care so much about using political power not against somebody, and all the preoccupations that Kant talks about. So I think that Kant's analysis does not apply only to populist degeneration of democracy, and it cuts deeper. Now, briefly on the actual consent reading, which is another challenge to my interpretation. I mean, very important people in the Kant scholarship, Ingeborg Maus, Pauline Kleinfeld, Susan Schell, and Gregory himself lately, have noticed that Kant, when he moves from perpetual peace to the doctrine of right, so only 2 years from one another, 1793, 1795, 1795, 1797, he says that you need the actual consent of people behind the laws, as opposed to an hypothetical consent, as he puts it in the earlier writings. So before he says, you may have a kind of benevolent dictator who issues laws on which there could be hypothetical consent of the population, and that's okay. So you can have a non-democratic system in which rulers rule as if they were interpreting the general will, as if they were ruling from the perspective of the general will. And, you know, earlier Kant seemed to have no problem whatsoever with this kind of system, to rule in a republican manner, even if we are not talking about republics, okay? Later, in the doctrine of right, he seems to say, no, hypothetical consent is not enough. You need actual consent. You need that people really say, okay, we like these laws. We approve of these laws. You don't get to think that I approve these laws, even if I don't do it explicitly. Now, if this is the case, of course, then much of my interpretation collapses, because, you know, okay, he might have had some problem in 1795 with democracy, but then when it comes to mature version of his political theory, the doctrine of right, he says, yeah, democracy is actually the best form of government. It's not at all necessarily despotic. He says you need the actual consent of the people behind the laws and not just the hypothetical one. So whatever Kant thought in 1795 is completely erased, recanted, rejected in only 2 years later, and therefore we can forget about his criticism, okay? That's pretty much what everybody thinks. Now, I don't think that this actual consent reading establishes that Kant made peace with democracy and that he recanted the criticism that he had 2 years before. Why not? Because I think that the actual consent reading makes a rather huge mistake when he interprets what Kant is talking about when he talks about laws and legislative power. So when the actual consent reading supporters, you know, point to the fact that Kant says laws require actual consent, I think that they assume that he's talking about laws as we understand them, that is what parliaments issue. So ordinary laws, okay? So if that is the case, obviously, then it means that you really need to live in a democracy in order to have a fair system, because ordinary laws have to be approved directly or indirectly by citizens. Now, I think that if you look I mean, anybody who reads Kant's political theory understands after 5 minutes that if the guy knows Rousseau, that Kant owes a lot to Rousseau. Even the terminology most of the time is taken precisely from Rousseau, general will, and so on. And I think that this applies to laws as well. Now, a recent strand of Rousseau scholarship, so I'm thinking about Colosse, Rios, and others, have argued, it's a controversial point, but this interpretation has, you know, received a lot of attention, and rightly so, I think. They argued that when Rousseau talks about legislative power or laws in general, he means constituent power. So what constitutional assemblies do when they shape the constitution. Now, if this is the case, of course, there is no problem in Kant saying, I mean, if Kant has the same notion of laws and legislative power, then there is no problem when he says that there must be actual consent behind laws, because what he means is that when you write a constitution for a people, the people have to approve explicitly of that constitution. It can be written by, you know, enlightened people or law professors or philosophers who sit down in a room like this, and then they issue, here is the constitution of Spain, Italy, Germany. Believe us, this is good. So take it from us. I mean, it never happens like that, right? Any constitutional assembly always requires the referendum that, you know, approves what it has done. and I don't know how it is in the Spanish system, but in Italy, if you want to change the constitution, either you do it with a super majority in the parliament, so 3/4 of the parliament has to approve, or you have to ask the people. And most of the time, the people say no, incidentally. The last two constitutional reforms proposed in Italy, one from the center left, back Renzi government 2016. Yes, 2016. And the last one, the one that, Meloni crashed against in March, were rejected by the people. So Meloni wanted to, what did they want to do? I forgot. I remember Renzi wanted to abolish the Senate, and the Italian people said no. And Meloni wanted to do something. Yeah. Jesus Christ, yes. She wanted to reform the way in which the highest body of the judiciary system is composed, which many thought it was a way of controlling the judiciary system and so on and so on. Anyway, without going into details, people said no. Now, back to our stuff. I think that the only thing that the actual consent reading establishes is the fairly, uncontroversial point that when you talk about constitutional laws, you need the actual consent reading. Kant thinks that you need the actual consent of the people behind constitutional laws. But this doesn't say anything about ordinary laws. So who has the business of applying these constitutional or transforming these constitutional laws into actual decision? Because the actual consent reading should prove that Kant also thinks that those who are supposed to transform this very general constitutional principle into actual decisions, so the way in which we organize the healthcare, the way in which we organize the university, the way in which we organize the professions, and so on and so forth. These should be in the hands of the people and requires actual consent of the people. And I challenge the supporters of the actual consent reading to find one line in which Kant even remotely suggests that this must be the case, that, administrators, like, Rousseau himself says, it is a great mystery to me how Rousseau has gone down in the history of philosophy of a great supporter of democracy. What he says about democracy is pretty nasty, and what he means is obviously that the social contract has to be shaped by the people. Sovereignty cannot be transferred. Sovereignty cannot be delegated. Yes, of course. What he means by that is that when you write the Constitution, ultimately you have to make it for yourself. You people have to make it for yourself. You can't transfer that role to anybody else. But this is fully compatible with the possibility that then the business of transforming this principle into actual decisions can be in the hands of an enlightened minority of administrators that are checked every, X years without going through elections, without going through the elections of representative in parliaments, the way we are accustomed. Okay, so I've already talked a lot. I think that the consequences for Kant's theory of democracy are fairly clear. And this ends my defense of the partisanship reading. Let's say something about the 6 extra pathologies quickly that I think becomes visible the moment in which you adopt the partisanship reading. One is what I call the privatization of politics, or the tyranny of the private, to distinguish it from the tyranny of the majority. So I argue that on Kant's reading, democracy fuels the idea that politics is nothing but the clash and composition of partisan interests. And therefore politics becomes nothing but strategic action. You try to push your agenda, the others do the same, and depending on how strong you are or how smart you are, you get your agenda to win over other agendas. And I think that this obfuscates the peculiarity of politics. Politics is not private action written large. Politics for Kant, and I think he's right about that, is an altogether form of agency. It's not like having an administrator of a private company or, the administrator of a condominium. Politics has to do with advancing the interest of all, not wronging anybody. Has to do with advancing what Rousseau calls the general good sometimes, or ruling from the perspective of the general will. This has nothing to do with strategic action. Now, the fact that politics as we know it has a lot to do with strategic action doesn't change the picture very much, because what we are doing here, of course, is to establish what a republic should look like and to rule out justification for political decisions that say, well, we decided this way because we had the strength to do it, we had the power to do it. If, this does not, take your interest and your rights into consideration, too bad. Next time, perhaps you'll get the chance to shape your own laws. But this time, we shape our own laws. And if you don't like it, too bad for you. Exactly this way of looking at politics, I think, is what Kant thinks is wrong. And unfortunately, is something, again, that is sort of suggested as the normal life of politics by the democratic logic. So if you avoid domination or tyranny merely via the balance of roughly equal private interests, well, you're not in a just system, you are not in a republican system. At best, you are avoiding a tyrant or a despots because it so happens that you have roughly equal opposing forces. The other pathology, and here I agree completely with Gregory, is that there is a conflation between the electorate and the people. So one of the problems with democracy is that electorates, so we now, to the next election, we think that we can do anything we please. Who else? Who is supposed to tell us what to do? And of course, this presupposes that you forget that political power must take into consideration the interest of future generations, for example, but in a sense also the interest and the values of past generations. So when you try to rewrite textbooks in high school by making, those who supported the Salò Republic, so the fascists after, the fall of Rome, and the capitulation of Italy to the Allies, and that tried to, help the Nazi to resist in the northern part of Italy. And you write that pretty much they were both fighting for their own cause, and there was no right or wrong there, and they were on the same page, and so on and so forth. You are violating the essential principles that past generations have upheld, and that constitutes the essence of a specific republic. So you cannot say that, even if for some unfortunate circumstance you have the power to do so, because you are violating something essential that past generations have established for this republic. But anyway, you get the point. I mean, the problem with asking the people to do whatever they think is right brings with itself the idea that at each election you are supposed to, push whatever you prefer without considering what previous generation and future generation might think about that decision. Another problem has to do with a peculiar threat to the separation of powers. So in well-functioning Republican democracies, it is wrong to assume that the whole power is in the hand of the people. If by that we mean, again, that at each election you have an unlimited mandate in which you can decide about anything. No, that's not true. I mean, the essence of a well-functioning Republican democracy is that you have, what the Americans call check and balances, that the popular will is checked by something that has nothing to do with popular will. So the judiciary, for example, the judicial review, not the judiciary. The judicial review is the obvious example. And this goes hand in hand with what we might call the mandate as strength. Okay, so the people want it. The people want it this way. Any opposition to the people would be a violation of democracy, a violation of justice, because there is nothing higher than the people, and by the people, of course, means this electorate wants. So this is, I think, is a peculiar threat to the separation of power, because it has to do with the idea that, powers are separated, but in the end, what people say matters much more than what other powers might say. And of course, this borders with the next pathology, which I call the illusion of an unlimited mandate. So precisely because democracy recognizes no authority above the people, politics is misunderstood as an agency that has no pre-political and moral constraints. So this pathology might be called also the immorality of politics. So we, the people, are called to decide on whatever we want and to do it on our own terms. There is nothing above us. There is no constraint behind and above popular will. I think that Kant makes absolutely clear when he talks in this letter to Nicolai, to this conservative intellectual Moser, if a people freely choose to be ruled by hereditary nobility, that is wrong, even if nobody imposed this hereditary nobility on them. So again, this, I think, should be taken in the sense that it's impossible that, like Rousseau says, that a people, it's impossible. It's not just that a people decides to have someone else write the constitution for them. It does not mean that it's immoral or it's unjust that a people decides for its own constitution, first person, but then decides to delegate to others, administrators, whatever you, the business of translating this principle into lower degrees pieces of legislation. So in general, the pathology I'm interested here is the idea that there is no moral authority above popular will. Sixth and second last pathology is what I call democratic nationalism. democratic leaders respond to a specific people, a specific group of people, and since they are delegated to advance the interest of that people, in the best case scenario, the whole people and not a part of the people, then it is absolutely normal that they ignore the interest of individuals who do not belong to that people. Notice, not just prioritize the interest of those who represent, but just ignore the interest of others. So I think that there is a specific kind of nationalism that is democratic nationalism, precisely because we are a democratic system. We decide for ourselves. We cannot be criticized from outside because we are below the standard and the threshold of political acceptability when we prioritize the interests of our competitors and we forget about the human rights of others. We are immune from external criticism. And this is a form of nationalism that is generated by this sort of democratic pride. Finally, I think that the one that is most damaging of all, yes, I've come to believe that of all these 7 pathologies, this one is the most dangerous, is what I call excessive proceduralism or the procedural obsession. So, as we all know, democracies have to do with procedures. I mean, we establish these procedures, then we have winners and losers. And, if the procedures were fair, whatever is the outcome of the decision made through this procedure must be fair. That's what I call the procedural obsession. I mean, it's very easy to imagine cases in which the procedures were respected and the results, the decisions made through those procedures are evidently unfair. I mean, democratic backsliding did not took a coup, right? There was no fascist coup that, establishes that, the gains of social cooperation had to go disproportionately in the hands of the 1%, of the 0.1%, and the rest, they struggle, who cares? I mean, there was no despotic coup that established this trend, and yet this is exactly what happened. So we have moved from more equal to less equal democracies in the last 20 years in a perfectly democratic manner. If you are caught in this logic of fair procedures is the only thing that matters, you may not even criticize the end result, because this was taken in a fairly correct manner, fairly democratic manner. Now, of course, this doesn't take into consideration hegemonic distortion of the popular will, doesn't take into consideration a lot of issues that could be cited in order to explain democratic backsliding through democratic procedures, and yet the point remains. It's easy to imagine, and we live in a world that is a big example of this. It's easy to imagine the perfect application of democratic procedures leading to evidently unjust outcomes. So I think that when Kant says, look, I don't care about the form of governance. I don't care about whether you are governed by democracy, autocracy, monarchy. I care about the quality of the political decision, the quality measured in Republican coin. And the Republican coin being the idea that you avoid domination, that political power is not used against anybody, the fact that, basic rights and liberties of all individuals are respected, that our being equal, at least in terms of civic and political rights, is respected. Unless you do that, I don't really care the way you reach a point in which these constitutional standards have been violated. It's wrong. And I don't care whether, it's a parliaments or enlightened despots who get you to a situation in which these constitutional standards are respected. So, okay, I think I will stop here because I've already talked 1 hour. Then there is a whole story about how you recover democracy and you make it a republican. You make it up to Republican standards, but I think there is a lot on the table. Perhaps I can say something in the question and answers.
Thank you, Luigi, for this very thoughtful presentation. I'm sure that you will have some questions to raise. If you raise your hands, perhaps we will start the Q&A. I will manage the Q&A. I think that 3 or 4 persons will leave this session. Do you have questions? Clara?
I was wondering about corporations and how corporations can privatize the general will, and what are your thoughts about that? Because I know there has been some Kant element also around corporations. I wanted to know what was your position around that.
Yeah, I mean, well, strictly speaking, I don't think this is a criticism that you can make to democracy. Yeah. But I mean, I think that this speaks more to the generation of democracy that can be spotted as the generation even if you abide to the democratic logic. Okay, so if you have a government like the US government now that clearly has a conflict of interest because they make money. I mean, the Trump family makes money knowing what political decision they're going to make beforehand. I mean, this cannot be put in the hands of democracy. I mean, on the shoulder of democracy. You see that this is a degeneration that, any democratic system worth the name should be able to oppose. In fact, the residual separation of power that you have in the US pretty much tries to do this as long as it lasts, obviously. So I don't think that the fact that corporations have become so influential within our democracies has to do with what I was talking about here. I mean, unless you mean that they have a partisan agenda, they are very effective in pushing it. I mean, in a sense it does. I mean, after all, if you start from the assumption that politics is nothing but the clash of partisan agenda, yeah, okay, within constitutional limits, more or less, okay, even if you have the power, you cannot, ban future elections or disenfranchise part of the population, okay, fine. But still, if you say, okay, I play within these limits, okay, but then within these limits, I can do whatever I want, right? It's just a question of power. It's just a question, do I have the influence strong enough in order to make this agenda win? Okay, let me use this huge amount of economic power in order to. Okay, so in a sense it's connected, because if you start with this assumption, it's precisely what justifies you in advancing your agenda within constitutional limits, knowing that, but after all, other people do the same. I mean, it's just a question that I'm stronger, right? So it's within the rule. That's exactly what I'd like to emphasize. I mean, this idea that political agency has to do with advancing one partisan agenda, or that the winning of one partisan agenda over other partisan agendas is fine as long as everybody got the chance to influence the political game, is wrong. Is despotic, is already despotic. Okay, so we are no longer already within a republic. The only way in which political power can be used in a republic is the advancement of the general good, period. It doesn't matter who does that. It doesn't matter who realizes this principle. A lot of people, a few people, one guy. For Kant, doesn't matter much who does that. What matters are results. So, yeah, corporations in this sense are relevant for what I was saying, because in a certain sense, what they've been doing to influence political power may descend from a misconception of politics that I've tried to identify. In another sense, it's not relevant for what I was saying, because when the influence becomes a conflict of interest, becomes an evident conflict of interest on the parts to those who rule, as in the case of Trump, this I don't think is something that you can say, you cannot put on the bill of democracy. It's just simply illegal.
Questions?
I think the question we have the probably be modified by something like climate emergency, for example.
By what?
By climate emergency, for example. I mean, in a way, all these of democracy from people whose life has to negotiate with people from the past and people from the future. And that was a very interesting question, very interesting question for a long time. But now something has changed. I mean, there are many things we can do, we can decide, which are not reversible anyway at all. So
Are not irreversible.
Are irreversible, are not reversible at all anyway. We're making decisions now that are against very individual rights, the right of life, for example, for few people in the future. I mean, I understand that may introduce many transformations of some transformations of the product. I can see clear which ones I want to argue how to say it could change some of the position.
Well, I don't know if I understood the question, but if you are asking what Kant, on my reading at least, would say about the problem of how you defend the rights, even basic rights like the right to life of future generation, well, that's a very fascinating question, because it speaks to the respect you owe to rational people who are not yet there, right? And in a certain sense, this intersects with classical themes in Kantian ethics and politics that have to do with what Kant has to say about the rights of people who lost their rational capacity, or were born without a rational capacity, or who have not yet irrational capacity because they're too young and so on and so forth. Well, my own take is that when Kant says that rationality is an end in itself, well, two things. One is that, of course, he means rationality as it is right now embodied in actual living beings, but since the problem is not the human being per se, but what the human being carries, that is this ability for rational agency, and this is something I want to specify, and that's the second point I want to make. Since it's not important the carrier, but what the carrier carries that generates respect, then the fact that I carry it now in 2026, but I know that other people might carry it in the future, imposes on me a constraint on the ability to. So, for example, Lucas Meyer, who is part of this network, thinks that a will or reason-based approach does not work for future generations because future generations, again, are not there, and therefore there is nothing to respect, even from a Kantian perspective. I think this is wrong. I mean, you can summarize the problem with a big hypothetical. If there are going to be future generations, on Kantian standards, they are owed the same degree of respect that it's owed to you as living right now. There is no difference whatsoever. Now, the second point I wanted to make is what on Kant's story, the way I read it at least, what are you really supposed to respect? Is it rationality understood as your ability of setting ends that are harmonious? Of choosing means that are harmonious with your ends? Is it practical reason understood of instrumental reason? So is it, if we want to use a fairly technical language, is it practical freedom, as Kant sometimes puts it? The fact that our ends are not imposed on us by anybody, so we are free in the sense that we can set our ends the way we want. Is this what we are supposed to respect? What generates, all? Well, I think that Kant is not entirely clear. There is a huge debate, of course. Does he think that it is this kind of rationality, the ground of the absolute value that we are supposed to carry? Or is it rather what he sometimes calls personality, which is not just being free in the sense that, if I want to drink Coke and not wine, I am the one who makes the decision, but I am free in a much higher sense, which presupposes morality. So it's not practical freedom, but it's autonomy. So it's not humanity, as Kant sometimes puts it, but personality that really carries the weight of, okay, this guy is capable of moral behavior. This guy is capable of, subduing anything natural within himself for the sake of the moral law. Well, I tend to think that Kant is more on this interpretation of his own theory. Even in the groundwork that sometimes are cited as example of his preference for humanity and not personality, I think he makes pretty clear that it's humanity insofar as it is capable of morality, which is a complicated way of saying not just rationality, but this higher form of rationality that leads you to moral behavior. The ability of moral behavior, not your performance. The fact that you can do it, whether you do it, is a different story. So, yeah, that it's not entirely relevant for what you said about future generation, but basically, I think that what I'm trying to say is that Kant has resources in order to make room for the protection of the rights of future carriers of these things that generates respect, and that I would further specify that this thing is their future ability to be moral agents and not just rational agents.
Thank you. I have a question regarding the relationship between economics and politics. So I was, when I was reading the paper, I was intrigued by your reference to neoliberalism and how neoliberalism actually fosters this problem of partisanship and privatization of politics. And I was thinking whether this is a problem that has its roots in liberalism rather than democracy, on the one hand, and then on the other hand, how our economy is what makes it also difficult for us to kind of subvert this mindset when we are thinking of politics. So, I mean, liberalism fits the economic system. If we're trying to develop a different political theory, a different understanding of what politics is, that has to do with the general will and so on, how are we in conflict with the economic system, and how can this alternative, political alternative, succeed if there is such conflict? And then this also has to do, I was thinking, with the cosmopolitan right. So yes, the cosmopolitan right seems to be a solution to the problem of democratic nationalism. But then again, if colonial extractivism is necessary for the economy, then a cosmopolitan right will not succeed.
Yeah. Wow, there is a lot to that, and everything is interesting. Okay, first of all, I used neoliberalism as an example of how you can regress to system in which justice is not served, like in our liberal democracy for many people, without a coup, as I was saying, without, a breach of democratic procedure. So I think that the significance of my reference to neoliberalism was less interesting than what you are suggesting. It was just an example. Like, do you want an example of how you follow democratic procedure and you end up in shit? Here, look at the neoliberal era and you understand what I have in mind. That's all I did in the paper. But what you're saying cuts much deeper, because you're saying, wait, who is responsible for this privatization of politics, for this partisanship, for this misunderstanding, misconception of political agency? Is it democracy or it's liberalism, right? That's the first part of your question. And it's very hard to respond, because on the one hand, of course, liberals, as you know, are those who are supposed to tame the power of democracy by introducing constitutional limits to what democracy may decide, right? So in one sense, liberalism is an ally against these pathologies. But I think you're right in saying that it might also become an enemy. Not accidentally, Kant is not a liberal, but he's a Republican thinker. So I guess that it all depends how you understand your sphere of freedom that liberalism protects for you, right? So after all, what is the main point of liberalism? The main point of liberalism is that no majority can impinge on certain basic rights that I have independently, if not before, at least independently of political power. So my right to life, my right to choose my religion, my right to associate with whoever I want, my right to have my political opinion, and so on and so forth. These do not depend on what democracy decides I can do, right? So no matter what majority is generated, this majority is not going to be able to change these rights I have. So in this sense, it's good. But if you understand this sphere of freedom as everything you need to care about from a normative point of view, I mean, everything that, let's put it this way, if you understand this sphere of freedom as the only thing that political power has to respect in order to be just, so if you take this sphere of freedom as a sufficient condition for justice and not just as a necessary condition for justice, then liberalism becomes an enemy. Because again, when we do politics, we have to remember that we are using the power of the many, and the power of the many can never become coercive without following the general good. So, provided that it's very easy to imagine political decisions that do not infringe on this sphere of freedom and rights, but that generate injustice, then the Republican movement becomes very important. So it's where liberalism is no longer sufficient. And that's why Kant is a Republican. Because again, he understands that being together in a society brings with itself obligations that go beyond the respect of certain basic rights that liberals are so fond of. So I think that perhaps this is what you have in mind when you say, is it more democracy or is it more liberalism? I think it's both, and it's only republicanism that is a cure for that. It's neither democracy nor liberalism, but republicanism. And I don't know if there was a third dimension to your question. Yeah, economy. Well, again, this is not something that I've discussed a lot today, but I think what you had in mind is more or less this. Well, I think you had 2 points there. One is, if the economy leads you to exploitation of somebody in order to thrive in general, then you have the economy that goes in a direction and justice that's going in another direction. Okay, that is absolutely reasonable. It's a Marxist criticism of liberal democracy. You can be nice and just at home only because you exploit somewhere elsewhere. And we can discuss a lot about that. If you ask me what Kant thinks about it, I think that he thinks that trade is nice, that international trade is nice and also conducive to peace, but not any kind of trade and not any kind of economic interdependence is nice. Example, colonialism, which is a form of interdependence, obviously, of economic interdependence, but is bashed and smashed by Kant as being, the most evident form of injustice. So I think that Kant would say it's beautiful to have international trade, it's beautiful to have free market, it's beautiful to have, if you wish, some form of capitalism, but Kant never says capitalism, obviously, but certainly is in favor of freedom of enterprise and so on and so forth. But this is, under the constraints of justice. So it depends what kind of trade you establish. It depends on what kind of economic interdependence you establish. There is nothing wrong in, having a free market and exchange of goods and so on and so forth. But, so, okay. That's the first thing you wanted to say. The second, I think, you wanted to point out, the other thing that I think I read in your question is whether the market, freedom of the market, freedom of enterprise, and individual pursuit of your interest in the economic sphere by itself doesn't constitute a big push to translate this logic from the economic sphere to the political sphere. So I don't know if this is what you had in mind.
My concern was more about how to implement in the political sphere an ideology like republicanism that doesn't fit as neoliberalism in the economic sphere.
I see.
So it was more about this possibility of there being, if it is possible, socially speaking, to have a contradiction between the economic sphere and the political sphere.
Yeah, no, that's a great question, I think, because, and again, it's more or less what Marx would say against Kant. Right? You have this beautiful ideal of the Republic, but you don't pay enough attention to the fact that the logic of the economy makes fairly impossible to realize this Republican ideal. And here it gets nasty, in the sense that I think that Kant would say, well, I'm not entirely sure that in a world in which the economy is left to the individual initiative of people, in which goods travels across frontiers, but frontiers are open, and so on and so forth, you will end up necessarily with some form of big injustice. I mean, after all, think about Europe, right? Then the European Union. We have a common market. We have had a common market for decades now. And whatever democratic backsliding happened in this part of the world is not in any sense connected to the enlargement of the size of the market, and the fact that we have been. I just bought a pump from Spain. And it was good that I could buy this pump from Spain because it was cheaper than the pumps in Italy, and probably it's a better product. I think this is good, and I don't think that this takes anything away from justice. In fact, I think that is, as Kant says sometimes about cosmopolitan right, if you do it in the right manner, it strengthens peace. It is an ally to peace, the fact that you are economically interdependent. So basically, I don't think that Marx is entirely right in saying you cannot establish a republic unless you remove the logic of the economy as we know it. And I think that the European Union, which accidentally is the closest thing that you get to the federation that Kant had in mind, they are all liberal democracies, which are not exactly the same as republics, but close enough. A lot of interdependence. There is a supranational union that is not exactly a state, but something in between a sheer confederation and a federation with coercive power. And again, I don't think that if democracies within Europe have backslided, the causes of this has to be found in the existence of the European Union. If anything, is more the way in which the world that encompasses the European Union has been evolving, with unfair competition, the inequalities booming in the United States and therefore also here. So yeah, I think it is possible to establish a republic even if you don't abolish private property or something like that.
I would like to say something. I have two remarks and two clear questions. I begin with two remarks about this very stimulating interpretation you presented of Kantian account of democracy, also to recognize which values contemporary democracy can have at present. The first thing has to do with distinction that I think fulfills a key role in your implementation. And perhaps didn't appear so clearly in the slides because it's an assumption that you make in your whole presentation. It has to do with the distinction between structural demands and private subjective demands.
Private demands.
Private and subjective demands in the political sphere. I think it's a very important distinction because we are living in political cultures where subjective demands are the model of the type of claim that people usually have in a public sphere. So I think the distinction is very important to also reshape this political culture and make room to give a larger role to structural demands. So that the main question here could be who is defending structural demands in the public sphere today. I think it's one important part of your argumentation. Another remark has to do with your own position toward interpreters, Kant scholars, defending that Kant was taking issue with populism. So he didn't defend democracy, he didn't assume democracy as a non-pathological form of government. I think that your presentation, and you also admitted it, partially overlaps with contemporary criticism of populism. But I think that there is another important conceptual shift here, because I have the impression that for you, populism is not a cause of democracy, of democratic pathologies, but is an effect among others. And so your structure and your view of the whole stuff is completely different, because populism is not the main drive to bring about democratic pathology, but it's an effect that we have to analyze among others, and so do enlarge the view. I think this is a very important and interesting characteristic of this interpretation you presented today, and you are working on in the last years. I moved to brief questions. The first one has to do with the position of your interpretation with regard to Leibniz moral socialism. Because I think hippies moral socialism could be a positive element to continue to strengthen your arguments. Because I have the impression that hippies' claims about the fact that Kant's political legacy hands together with the defense of general structures of justice, I think has more to do with your Republican account of Kant's account of democracy than with supporters of Kant's representative democracy. I think you have more to do with this development of Leibniz in the field of Kant's political legacy. I think you are closer to her than people defending that Kant would endorse representative democracy. But I would like to hear you speaking a little more about this point. And the last question about Kant's general will, because my misgivings towards this concept had to do with the fact that I'm not sure reading Kant, and I didn't achieve to have a convinced position throughout the years about the fact whether Kant's general will aligns better with the status quo, so to say, briefly speaking, or involves a decided transformative power towards the democratic, economic inequality and social domination, for instance. I'm not sure whether Kant's general will is closer to this status quo in the field of properties. People have more properties than others, and the general ruler is not intended to equally distribute these properties among citizens, including also passive citizens. I have doubts that this view could be the Kantian one. I have also, however, I highly sympathize with the view that Kant's general will involves this transformative power, so that the higher ruler is also intended to grapple with and to struggle against economic inequality, for example. But I'm not sure about that. An example of this could be the following: how Kant's general will deals with the distinction between passive and active citizenship. I would like also to hear you talking a little bit more about these points, these blind spots in the view of Kant's political philosophy.
Yeah, well, Nuria, that's a lot. No, it's very interesting. I regret that I didn't have a pen to put it down, but I think I will remember all your two remarks and your two questions in reverse order. Okay, Joan. First of all, I never suggested that Kant's general will has to do with the status quo. I know you are not attributing to me this position, but I mean, it's clearly a normative concept. It was in Rousseau, and it is has nothing to do with the average opinion in a country or of a people, right? My own reading of the general will is what people should consent to, provided that they have the overarching highest goal of avoiding domination. So I'm very close to Ripstein here, that, like you were suggesting, thinks that, among other things, passive citizenship is a problem that should be in the hands of the ruler, provided that passive citizenship is close to a condition of domination. So it may be true that you cannot grant the right to vote to passive citizens because de facto they might increase the power of the powerful, as opposed to, I think Kant is wrong about that, but his empirical reasoning there is pretty straightforward. If you allow passive citizens to vote, you are going to increase the power of those who have the means on which the passive citizens' subsistence depend. Now, I think that is empirically wrong about this, because historically we know that once disenfranchised sectors of the population were given the right to vote, they did not increase the power of the powerful, but they had something to negotiate with. And, their condition moved away a little bit from passivity towards activity, not entirely, but okay. So, back to the main point, I think that Ripstein is right in saying passive citizenship being a condition in which people are not entirely authors of their own life is a problem that the law should address. And the fact that it is compatible, that in a transition towards a more just evolution, you deny the right to vote to passive citizens, does not take anything away from the fact that passive citizenship remains a problem within a republic that needs to be addressed. So that's something that I completely share with you. Of course, you have done a wonderful job on social suffering from a Kantian perspective. I remember the famous conference in Florianopolis when we were discussing with Susan Schell about this stuff, and to what extent Kant can be enrolled in a fight against excessive inequality. Now, I think that Kant would say that excessive inequality becomes a problem when we have reason to believe that, again, some sector of the population is using this disproportionate amount of economic power in their hands in order to dominate another part of the population. This is a problem for Kant as well. I mean, there is no justification in the exercise of your freedom of enterprise, individual rights, and so on and so forth, that may lead to a structural condition in which somebody is dominated. I mean, there, I think that Kant would say, no, your exercise of your freedom of enterprise, of your right to, become rich and become, wealthy, finds a very clear limit that cannot be overcome. Now, does this make my position closer to Lea moral socialism than less position in which this structural transformation does not need to get to the point in which we abandon, because Lea is a Marxist, basically. So her point in the end is we have to get rid of capitalism, we have to get rid of free market, we have to get, it's not like liberal socialism with rules, okay, yeah, socialism, okay, we own, the means of productions are publicly owned, and yet, for some reason, democracy and individual freedoms remain protected. I mean, I don't know exactly what she means by moral socialism. I never entirely understood, but it sounds like it's a system in which the economy is no longer left to private initiative, and the means of production are publicly owned. And I'm not sure that I want to go that way. I'm not sure that Kant would want to go that way. But I'm not denying that there is a very important space for addressing structural injustice in Kant. That's nothing to do with have we denied the freedom of expression to somebody? Have we violated some of the basic liberal rights of individuals without looking at the way in which these various bits of agency form in a way in which structural injustice is generated and domination? I think that for Kant the issue is domination, because he's a Republican, right? So if you prove to me that this economic structure generated by an involuntary addition of individual decision generates a condition of domination, then of course it's the business of the state to stop that. Does that require that means of production are publicly owned? I don't know. So that's where I do. But yes, I mean, and going backward to your remarks, yeah, I think that I should rephrase somewhere this point in terms of structural injustice, because that's what I'm trying to get at. You're right. Yes. What I'm saying is that you can have all the beautiful procedures that you want. You can have liberal individual rights respected, and you may end up in a situation in which you have created structural injustice, but you don't have the means to address it. And I think that the way in which Kant intuits this problem is by saying, I don't care the way you make political decisions. What I care is the quality of the political decision. That translated in terms of an attention to structural injustice by saying, I don't care whether, no rights of an individual woman has been violated, but if it so happens that in a society women's rights are less important than men's rights, we still have a problem. So, but you're right, that's exactly where I want to go, where I talk about procedural obsession. There are things that you don't get your hands on by merely looking at the way in which political decisions have been taken. So yeah, probably reformulating this in terms of structures is important. Did I leave anything out? Maybe the first remark.
Yes, I think you remarks the person. I don't know if you'd like to have a second round Q&A. So we will stop here. Yeah, just not a reply, a comment on your replies to my text. I was also thinking in Nicolas Rosado's interpretation of the structural differences in Kant's philosophy. I think he's not so socialist or socialist as in the case of Leaiti, but he also tries to hang Kant's positions about social and political justice in a close contact with this principle of independent interdependence. And even if Rosales claims for common ownership of means of production and things of this sort, I think this structural principle will also be a fruitful dialogue, will bring about a good dialogue with your interpretation.
Yeah, you're right.
I don't know if you would like to say something about this. Also, this is a partner of JUSTLA project.
No, you're right. I think that the only difference between Nicolas and I on this issue is that I come from a liberal background and he comes from a Marxist background, but we are both trying to get our hands on these interdependencies, as you were saying, or structural issues that I think that democracy by itself is poorly equipped to address. Unless by democracy you mean something that is by definition in favor of the working class of people, which is a big mistake, I think. No, you're right. I mean, it's only where we come from that differs, because I think that we have a common preoccupation that the thing that makes the life miserable for so many people living in liberal democracy has very little to do with democratic procedures and a lot to do with the way in which structural injustice builds up through a number of decisions that taken individually perhaps don't even have the goal of generating these forms of domination. But then that they do, they end up doing that. That's why I was trying to push the idea, in the end, the quality of politics should be measured not in terms of where the procedures exactly follow, but in terms of to what extent constitutional principles have been realized, to what extent the situation we have is harmonious with the picture of our society as it is described in the Constitution. Because I think that a lot of progressive minds have too much faith in the fact that democratic procedures are going to get what they want. Now, as I said, to be fair, perhaps democratic procedures generate bad results because they are rigged, that there are biases, that that public opinion is now completely off the mark because somebody wanted to be off the mark, because there was powerful interest to focus more on immigrants as opposed to economic inequality. The problem is how secure our streets are as opposed to maybe it is a problem if even in Europe the 1% has become super rich the way in which it was not. So I have mixed intuitions there. Perhaps if there were a perfectly just formation of the public opinion, we would have democracies that work much better than they do now. But what I want to oppose, what I want to react to is the idea that we do not have the means to criticize a certain political setting simply because it was democratically generated. I think that one of the great resources that Kant gives us is to say, look, I don't care so much whether this is democratically generated because I have independent standards to measure the injustice of the system, even if the people wanted it that way. And this is important. I mean, I think that there is a 2 or 3 level independence that Kant has and that many people miss. One is that the fact that the democratic will is generated, the fact that the decision is democratically made by itself doesn't make it in conformity with the principle of right. So you may have democratic decisions that is not compatible with the overarching principle of justice understood at the level of the law. And then there is a second degree of independence in which, but this is more controversial, obviously, but I also think that the normativity of the universal principle of right ultimately depends on the normativity of the categorical imperative. So, in a certain sense, the normativity of the law ultimately depends on something that has nothing to do with politics. So I am a dependentist, so I said it's a controversial point among Kant scholars, as you well know. But I was never convinced by this idea that the normativity of the universal principle of right is independent, that stands on its own feet without, relying on the fact that you need to build a society in which the spheres of freedom are equal and most extended and there is no dominance, unless you bring in the big assumption that you need to have this society so shaped because any other society violates the moral essence of the people who live under that society. Because if that is not the case, if you don't bring this moral premise into the picture, then I think you leave open the possibility that you have a system in which the people decide to have smaller spheres of freedom compared to others, because this generates more well-being for them than being precisely equal with itself. So, imagine that we build a fantastic AI that only a few engineers know that will tell us exactly what to do in the future. And many people think, if I have to give up my right to shape the Constitution, and in return I have more secure, well-being and happiness and stuff like that, why? I'm very happy to do so. So you would have a violation of the universal principle of right, that, you know, would be hard to be resisted without bringing in the premise that you cannot do that, because otherwise some people would not be respected in their moral essence. So that's another story.
Could I raise?
Yeah, of course.
A last point. Would you say that Kant's notion of law, as you presented it, as an issue related to constituent power more than to legislative power, could open up fruitful dialogues with Marxian scholars?
With who?
With Marxian scholars, with Nicolas Gonzalez,
Yeah.
than to liberal Kant scholarship. I have the impression that the framework of constitutional law in Kant's political philosophy could be more friendly to Marxist approaches to Kant's political legacy than the field of executive power, where I see the influence of liberal market, of classical liberal accounts of the economic market and thinking in Adam Smith, for example, are the main influences. So I think that perhaps some reason of these debates about Marx and Kant scholars and the Toronto School, for example, more Ross and interpretations of Kant has to do also with the
this notion of the law.
Yes, yes.
I completely agree. You're right, and it's a very beautiful point. Yes, I mean, emphasizing that legislative power and the law for Kant pretty much means constitutional law and constituent power. I think that gets me closer to people who think about politics in a less individualistic manner, in which politics cannot be just generated by the aggregation of individual opinions, completely automatized. But yeah, I didn't think about that. And I think that even the Toronto School, even Ripstein, try to make some room for these more structural issues as opposed to, we start from Rawls and Rawls' interpretation of Kant, and that's it. I think that, force and freedom is based on the idea that the entire effort by Kant is to generate a system in which nobody is dominated. I think that in order to achieve that, you have to pay attention to structural injustice, and structural injustice is not captured by an attention to democratic procedures, an attention to taking the right to private property as an absolute. There is a distinction between wanting the public ownership of the means of production and taking the right to property as an absolute that cannot be negotiated. There is a lot in between, and I think it's there that one should be, and I suspect that it's not where Leah and Nicolas would like to come. They want to stay more on the side of, no, it's not enough that you limit or make the right to private property dependent or in need of harmony with other normative desiderata. They really want to say you have to move away from there, and I'm not sure that I want to follow that.
Okay, thank you, Luigi, for this wonderful conference.
Thank you for the attention. And so,
a plan.
Another thing to in the stream right now.
okay.
So, just a second.